Hello friends, and welcome to day 32. Congratulations, you've made it to day 32 of our chronological Bible reading commentary. Keep up the great work. Don't let anything get in the way of continuing in the scripture. If you miss a day, just pick up where you left off and keep moving forward. All right, let's jump in today. My name's Kenny. I make these videos in order to force myself to think a little more clearly about the scripture as I'm reading it daily, as I put together some thoughts to share with you. Today's a doozy, so let's jump right in. We're in Exodus 7 through 9, where God puts his full might and power on display against the gods of Egypt. He's doing this in order to demonstrate to the Israelites, who haven't heard from him in about 400 years, to demonstrate to the Israelites that he is God, that this God that is calling them out of Egypt is someone worthy of following. He's also doing this to demonstrate to Egypt that he is God, that he's greater than all of their gods, and to all of us, to all the world, that he is God. So let's take a look at how he does that. It begins with Moses and Aaron going before Pharaoh and asking Pharaoh to let God's people go for just 3 days. 3 days off, that's all they ask. He's a terrible boss, so he says no. They wanted 3 days to go out in the wilderness and sacrifice to their God. But he says no. So Aaron takes his rod, throws it on the ground, and it becomes a snake. This is not a trick. This is a miracle. But the magicians that were in the court of Pharaoh had a trick where they could do something similar. Only, it's best understood that what they would do was, rather than throwing a real staff down and it became a snake, and then picking up by the tail and it getting stiff again, they would throw a real snake down that they had paralyzed by pinching its neck. It would wiggle around and they could pick it up by the neck and it would be paralyzed again. There's a big difference between picking up a snake by the head and by the tail. So Aaron throws his rod down. The magicians throw theirs down, and there's the snakes, but Aaron's snake eats all of the other magicians' snakes. And then he picks that thing up and it becomes a rod again. Pharaoh doesn't care. His heart is hard and he doesn't let the people go. So God, through Moses and Aaron, tells Pharaoh, I'm going to visit plagues on you. And so the plagues begin. Now what's interesting with the plagues is, as they unfold, God reveals more and more of himself and his power. The first plague is the plague of blood, where Moses and Aaron go to the river. They strike the river Nile, it turns into blood, and all the fish die, and the water becomes undrinkable, and it stinks. The magicians are able to turn some water into blood, not in a whole river full, but some water into blood, just enough to convince Pharaoh that this is just a trick. So Moses and Aaron say, fine. They go back to God. God says, go back to Pharaoh and do another plague. So the second plague is the plague of frogs. So now remember, the Nile still stinks. That's important, because these Pharaoh's magicians, they can do things, but they can't fix anything. And God's going to demonstrate that he can fix things. So Moses and Aaron say, there's going to be frogs everywhere in your houses and your food if you don't let my people go. Pharaoh says, whatever, I'm not going to let your people go. And again, there's a plague. So the next day, the frogs show up, and they're everywhere. But this time you see a little shift in Pharaoh, because Pharaoh comes to Moses and says, Moses, will you pray that the frogs will go away? Now, the magicians were able to produce some frogs, but out of seemingly thin air, a lot like sleight of hand and things like that. Some people think that this was actually a satanic thing, where there were powers they were given by Satan. I think they were just sleight of hand magicians. I think that's a little more historical. There's some more historical evidence for that happening all throughout history than any kind of real satanic magic happening, though it's entirely possible. So anyway, as we continue forward, the frogs fill the land, and Pharaoh asks Moses to get rid of the frogs. Now this is where God demonstrates another thing he can do, and that is timing. God can time when things happen. So you may say that these things happen naturally. It's timing that often represents a miracle, not just the fact that something can be done. So God has that ability. So Moses says it's going to happen. He lets Pharaoh actually pick the time it's going to happen. Pharaoh says tomorrow. So the next day, like clockwork, all the frogs are dead. Now Pharaoh has a land full of dead fish, water you can't drink, and piles of dead frogs. It stinks. They're just frogs everywhere. The piles remain. Now, the third one that comes around, the third plague is the plague of gnats, where when the gnats come and they cover the entire land, even the magicians start saying, Pharaoh, we can't do that. That is the hand of God. It's timing and location. And that's what we see in the fourth plague. That God is not only the God of what happens, but he's also the God of when it happens and where it happens and who it happens to. So the fourth plague is the plague of flies. So Moses says there's going to be flies everywhere, and Pharaoh says, I'm not going to let your people go. So he says that flies are going to affect all of Egypt, but it's not going to affect God's people. And so sure enough, the flies affect all of Egypt, but they don't affect the land of Goshen. And this is a theme that's going to continue through the rest of the plagues. So the land of Goshen, remember, is where the Israelites live. Okay? So the fourth plague comes. It comes when Moses says it's going to come. It comes where Moses says it's going to come. And in this, Moses makes another important point, that there's a distinction between the Egyptians and God's people. There's a distinction between all people and God's people, which is important because as you come into the family of God, you step into his presence, you step into his realm, you step under his authority and his guidance and his protection. And that's what you see going on with the Israelites. They are under his protection. And so the flies come, they cover the whole land, and now you've got and then God removes the flies as Moses goes and prays for God to remove the flies. The flies actually go away. So now you've got that not only can God time when something happens, he can time the consequences of it, he can also remove the consequences. We also see in Pharaoh in this plague of the flies, that Pharaoh comes to Moses and doesn't say just pray to your God that this will end. He says pray for me. So even in Pharaoh, with all of his hard heart, he's beginning to see who God is. There's people who don't believe in God who will still ask people to pray for them. You see this all the time. When people are in trouble and they say, pray for me, they don't believe themselves, but they think maybe somehow you've got some magic wand that you can go to God and fix their problem, even though they don't want to believe in him. You can't count on God acting in those cases. Still pray, because he might, and they might come to him. But you never know. So the next plague is also one of timing, location, and a distinction of people, and that's the plague of dead livestock, where God kills all of the livestock in Egypt, but none of the livestock in Goshen, where the Israelites are. The sixth plague is a plague of boils. Once again, you have a plague of timing, location, and distinction. You've got all of Egypt, all the people of Egypt get covered in painful sores and boils, but none of the people of Israel do. None of the people in Goshen do. The Israelites don't get it. They haven't been covered in flies. They haven't been covered in gnats. They haven't been covered, had dead livestock. Their water's been fine. None of these things have affected the people of Israel. And then the seventh plague we have, and this is the last plague for today's reading, is the plague of hail. Once again, timing, location, and distinction. The hail comes, and those people that followed God's warning and took their livestock and put them under cover, their livestock weren't killed. See, this time God said, hey, if you want to follow me, here's how you can save your livestock. And some people of Egypt had started to fear God. And so they moved their livestock when they heard that this hail was coming. And their livestock didn't die. But the storm came in. It ripped everything off the trees. It killed the food on the ground, like the wheat in the fields and things like that. Or the barley, but not the wheat. You'll see that in the passage. And it killed all the animals that had not been put up. And I'm sure it killed some people. But not in the land of Goshen. So we see today that God is mighty in all things. He is the greatest God. He can be sovereign. He is sovereign and powerful over the timing of things, over the location of things. And his miracles are unbelievable. They're incredible. I can testify in my life. I look at my own life and I look at the timing of when things happened, and I cannot get away from the fact that I could not have made things happen in that way, in that time, in that process. And I promise you, and here's the thing I want you to walk away with today. I promise you that if you ask God to show you himself and what he's doing, and you are willing to accept what you see, you will see God working in your life, and you will see his timing, and you will see his guidance. Just give it a shot. All right, love you guys. And I hope you've been blessed by today's reading and commentary. We'll see you on day 33. Keep up the great work.